Each of these strikes hits closer to home. It brings the realities of this war to the Russian population in a way that I think really will undermine Putin's standing, and it will make it more difficult for him to exact the kind of impact in Ukraine that he seeks to do as he desperately tries to hold on to even just the ground that they have conquered in the last several months. And a very good evening to you.
Really good to have you with us tonight. Tell us, first of all, what you make of this latest salvo from the Russians hitting once again at the energy infrastructure in Ukraine.
Well, I think it's quite frankly, Carol, barbaric, and we really need to call it out for what it is, putting the lives of children, the lives of civilians in danger, those who are not combatants in this conflict. And instead, Putin seems to meet every attempt by the Ukrainians to counterpunch with another vicious attack on infrastructure. And it's easy for us to talk about electrical grids and power stations, but at the end of the day, it's about the lives, the health of some of the most vulnerable people in the country.
Yeah, indeed, because if people are left without electricity, clearly it's difficult for millions and millions of people, but it's also a real risk to many vulnerable people, to the elderly, and at a time when temperatures are really beginning to dip in Ukraine.
Indeed, and I think it is a global responsibility, and we've seen this unfortunately at several points during Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to add to the pressure on Moscow and Putin directly to say this is unacceptable. In the 21st century, you cannot fight a war. Certainly, obviously, we have a principle going back to the Peace of Westphalia that you shouldn't invade other countries, but even more so, you cannot fight a war in this fashion. And I think a heavy burden falls particularly on Europe and those, quite frankly, who are arguing that we should sit down and negotiate with Putin, even as he is putting so many civilians' lives in danger and costing so many civilian lives.
Yeah, I mean, what should the response from the West be to this, do you think? Clearly, the Ukrainians continue to ask for more air defenses, but do we need to provide more practical help as well? Do we need to provide more help in rebuilding the damaged power installations, perhaps providing generators and so on?
Oh, I think all of the above. First and foremost, yes, every available air defense system ought to be sent without delay to Ukraine to try and prevent lives. I mean, this is a question of clear and present danger to so many civilians. And then, as you said, Carol, what else can we do to augment? I know that the U.S. government last week announced 53 million, if I'm quoting the figure correctly, in help for that electrical grid. I think Europe and European nations ought to be stepping up on that front, ought to be offering much more. There was an interesting article by the German ambassador to the United States today talking about how Europeans, Germans are going to have to turn down by a few degrees their heating to save money. And then you have just, a few thousand kilometers away, those in Ukraine who have no heat. So I think we really need to focus on the priorities and those who are in greatest danger here.
What do you make of these other reports that have emerged today that Russian military airfields were hit by explosions? The Russians are saying that they intercepted Ukrainian drones. I mean, if this was indeed a Ukrainian attack on airfields on Russian soil, that would be quite significant, wouldn't it?
It would. And look, there have been attempts, a report in the Wall Street Journal out this morning documents how those HIMAR systems, the missile systems, were actually adjusted secretly by U.S. personnel so that the Ukrainians couldn't shoot them so far. And yet, we continue to force the Ukrainians to fight with one hand tied behind their back, striking at where some of those sorties, those missions of bombers are coming from, or the Iranian drones are being sent off of. I mean, this is all about ultimately Ukraine defending itself and trying to push back the invading forces from their territory. So, I am of the view that we have to acknowledge that in this kind of conflict, the Ukrainians have the right to strike well into Russian territory.
Yeah, I mean, there were 3 Russian servicemen apparently killed at these bases where long range strategic bombers are thought to be based. And Ukraine hasn't officially commented, but I'm looking at a report that its Air Force tweeted what happened with a partying face emoji and images of what looked like a badly damaged aircraft. I mean, is this Ukraine sort of dropping a big hint that its forces were or its drones were responsible? Whereas if it directly claimed responsibility, then that could lead to perhaps an even further escalation.
Well, this is certainly part of what we've seen a lot of from Kiev, the tacit or the implicit admission. And look, I mean, they, for a variety of reasons, may not want to reveal their operations, accept and acknowledge responsibility for some of these instances. There also, quite frankly, been plenty of incidences which seem to be attributed simply to poor management by Russian soldiers. And so at the end of the day, Ukraine's going to take the propaganda value from all of these and try to exploit it. But I do think that there is a real strategic need. If Russia has to defend some of these bases with more of those missile systems, with more troops, those represent fewer missile systems and troops that they can send into Ukraine.
And do you think it is going to send, I mean, a further signal to President Putin of the costs he's paying for continuing this war if he's actually facing hits now on his own military bases?
Well, and it will further erode certainly the support amongst the civilian population in Russia, who already obviously have started to question some of the wisdom of Putin's special operation, as he calls it, in Ukraine. And each of these strikes hits closer to home. It brings the realities of this war to the Russian population in a way that I think really will undermine Putin's standing, and it will make it more difficult for him to exact the kind of impact in Ukraine that he seeks to do as he desperately tries to hold on to even just the ground that they have conquered in the last several months.
You talked a moment ago about the response from Europe. Yeah, we had President Schultz talking potentially about some future negotiations. There now seem to have been comments from President Macron as well. I mean, do you think that that is just facing up to the reality that sooner or later there are going to have to be some kind of talks to bring this to a halt? Or do you think that there are real risks in even discussing this sort of thing at this time?
Well, look, I'm a former diplomat, so I always believe in the power of negotiation, but I think it is a question about how and when. What I am concerned about, and we saw this last month of reports, unnamed reports from the White House suggesting that somehow the U.S. was pushing Zelensky to the negotiating table. And what's concerning to me about that is I think it is part of an effort by both the Biden administration and, for that matter, some European leaders who just want to bring a quick resolution to this. And we've been there before. Let's not forget we had Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, each of which were negotiated agreements to address Russia's invasion of Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea in 2014 when I was in the White House. So Putin may well accept an invitation to negotiate. He may well reach an agreement, but it doesn't signify that the conflict is coming to an end, and we risk empowering, emboldening him to go farther and to hold out for more.
Yeah, and of course, President Zelensky has been insistent, hasn't he, that he's not going to accept any freezing of the front lines as they are now, any kind of talks that would be based on Russia gaining those parts of Ukraine's territory which are already occupied by Russian forces.
Indeed. And look, I think at the end of the day, this is a question for Zelensky and the Ukrainians. And Western leaders ought to cease and desist from this unwise, this self-interested pressure on Zelensky to stop, even as his troops gain momentum on the battlefield. I think it is up to Ukraine to decide what territory is enough to give, because would we ask the United Kingdom or the United States to give up provinces? I don't think so, and I don't think we would accept that as a reasonable negotiation point.
Um, just let me ask you, there's a story on the front page of one of the British newspapers in the morning, the Financial Times reporting an oil tanker jam gathering off Turkey as the launch of the Russian oil cap halts sailing. So the EU has announced this price limit on the amount of money that any EU countries will pay for oil. Moscow's now saying it's not going to deal with any country that, that sticks to that price cap, and there now seems to be a row about insurance. And you've got oil tankers apparently just queuing up off Turkey at a time when the United States, the UK, Europe, and everyone else is already facing soaring energy bills because of the repercussions from the war.
Look, I think it's a really smart strategy that was concocted between Washington and European capitals to say, how can we try to limit some of the funds going to Moscow? And many of these tankers are insured by European, American firms, and so we do have some control that we can exert over them. It'll be interesting in the coming weeks and months to see how ultimately it plays out. Obviously, Moscow, as always, will threaten retaliation, but ultimately, this may be one of those things that really bites on Putin's budget.
And just finally, Brett, I mean, there has been a lot of concerns that, especially in some Republican circles, there was support for their support for the amount of backing which the United States is giving to Ukraine was starting to wane because of the cost of it all. Do you think that that is now less significant given the results of those midterm elections, or is there still a real danger that President Biden will face increasing opposition to the fact that, of course, continuing to support Ukraine has a cost to the American public?
Well, I do think that it is a risk. We are going to have a divided Congress, and ultimately, the Republicans who control the House of Representatives are not going to be as supportive both of budget for Ukraine as well as a foreign policy budget and agenda in general. That being said, I think this is also a moment for Europe to look at what it is giving. And we have countries like the French, the Germans, who are falling woefully behind the United Kingdom and the United States. I think they do need to show that they're willing to invest in this and not simply, put out strongly worded statements.